How do the Japanese plan to recover from the defeat at Henderson Field? And how would Vandegrift seek to seize the initiative? We look at the fourth battle of the Matanikau.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Welcome back to the podcast. This episode, number 149, looks at how both the Japanese and the Americans react after what happened at Henderson Field. The Battle of Henderson Field was the turning point in the Guadalcanal campaign on land. It was the last time that the Imperial Japanese Army would seriously threaten Henderson Field. But it's important to remember that the Guadalcanal campaign was a joint campaign. The Imperial Japanese Army wasn't operating by itself. We've seen the night bombardments, we've seen the Navy's attempts to resupply the Army, but it wasn't just that. Admiral Yamamoto had also sent a task force south with 4 aircraft carriers, looking for the decisive Mahanian battle that the Japanese Navy craved. That was the strategic goal of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Against this force, Halsey has just 2 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. They are met at the Battle of Santa Cruz in late October. The Battle of Santa Cruz takes place from October 25 to 27. Halsey had only taken command of the South Pacific area on October the 18th. He has just 1 week to get up to speed from taking over command and the Battle of Santa Cruz. And indeed, he wrote in his memoir that when he found out that he was to take over command of SOPAC, Jesus Christ and General Jackson, this is the hottest potato they ever handed me. Well, he handled that hot potato pretty well. The outcome was that 2 of the Japanese carriers were damaged and needed to return to Japan for repairs, while on the US side, the Hornet was sunk and the Enterprise was damaged. This left Halsey with just 1 carrier in the Pacific supporting the Guadalcanal campaign, and it too was damaged. The Enterprise crew, however, weren't daunted. A sign appeared in the hangar deck, Enterprise versus Japan. The sign reflected the parlous state of US Navy carrier aviation in the Pacific, but it also represented the determination of the Enterprise crew to get on with the job. Tactically, the Battle of Santa Cruz was a victory for the IJN. However, strategically, it was a loss. In its carrier aviation capability, Japan had created an incredibly sharp sword, but it had little ability to repair the blade and limited capacity to forge replacements. The Battle of Santa Cruz saw 99 Japanese aircraft lost, with 148 pilots and aircrew. The experienced pilots lost at Santa Cruz could not be replaced quickly, nor to the same standard. As a result, there was a marked decline in the effectiveness of Imperial Japanese naval aviation. The losses at Santa Cruz compounded the losses that the IJN had experienced in the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Eastern Solomons. Whilst the IJN continued to fly the same aircraft, the pilots flying them no longer possessed the same level of skill or experience. If we step back and look at the period from late October to early November 1942 at the strategic level, we see just how crowded the landscape really is. The Second Battle of El Alamein is being fought. The Battle of Stalingrad is still raging. And critically, something that would have been keeping up the US Joint Chiefs of Staff awake at night, the forces for Operation Torch are underway. The invasion convoys are heading for Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. They are heading through U-boat patrolled waters ahead of the landings, which are scheduled for early November. All of this is happening at the same time as the fighting on Guadalcanal, and I think it's important to remember that context. While Guadalcanal is an incredibly important campaign, it is not the only thing occupying Allied strategic attention. Figures like Admiral King and the President of the United States himself are balancing Guadalcanal against multiple major operations unfolding simultaneously across the globe. With all of this in mind, let's get back to our interview with Dave Holland. Morning, Dave. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, James. It's good to be back.
The Battle of Henderson Field, it sees realistically the culmination of the Imperial Japanese Army on Guadalcanal. But that's not how the Imperial Japanese headquarters saw it. What was their assessment after the Battle of Henderson Field?
Well, I'll take it down to the 17th Army of Hayakataki. These are the guys on the ground that had that firsthand information. So the information coming to them was, look, we just had a great victory at sea, sinking American battleships and carriers. And so that came on. They knew they'd had a major setback on land because the airfield wasn't taken. But Hayakataki and his army staff knew there were plans in place to bring a whole fresh Japanese division with tons of supplies, more tanks, more artillery. That was due in 2 weeks. So they said, okay, well, we almost won because our battleship bombardment, they thought we were very close to destroying or suppressing the American Air Force, which is the main thing we need to suppress. They knew it by that stage of the campaign. That was the major thing they needed to take out with the Americans. They couldn't take an Air Force out. They're going to have problems. Like we discussed in the last episode, with supply, bringing in troops, and just dominating the daylight sea area. Aerial denial during the sea. They couldn't get in during the day. So they said, we almost did it. We almost did it. And they said, we almost was that close to taking the airfield. With this fresh division we got to come in, the 38th that's coming in with all this fresh supplies, no problem. We understand there's more air bases being built in the Upper Solomons at Munda and Buin. Sorry if I butchered that name, but B-U-I-N, Buin, up in Upper Solomons. And with hundreds of airplanes coming in, they've been promised all this. And once those hundreds of airplanes come in, they would just gain air superiority. And then we would bring all these 11 transports in one dump instead of just bringing them in piecemeal. Because we discussed, I think, one of the first episodes, that they had concerns that when a unit lands on Guadalcanal, after 1 week or definitely 2 weeks, they're starting to be less effective. And that was the problem the Japanese had when they were bringing in like one regiment, and 2 or 3 weeks later, another regiment. And by the time they get ready to advance in an offensive, one regiment's already spent. They don't really have any fresh regiments. So Hayakataki wanted the Imperial Japanese Navy to bring them all in one go. So that means as soon as they land, they can go straight in. And we'll see it later in the campaign. Americans did the same thing. They felt the same way. They knew this because, once again, this affects humans the same way, whether Japanese or Americans. We'll see it with the 25th Infantry Division with Americans later in the campaign. They drop them in 1 week. But definitely, they weren't defeated. They didn't feel defeated. Their morale was still high because they had the fresh promise of fresh hope and fresh reinforcements coming their way. And they go, yep, okay, we just had a minor setback, and we'll basically finish it in 2 or 3 weeks. That was the plan.
The 17th Army, they've become quite spread out now. They've got troops all around the AO and they're unable to support each other. What were the left and right columns doing after the battle?
So the left column went to Murayama with the 16th, well, regiments, you could say, 16th and the 29th Regiment and his engineers. They pulled back basically the way they came, down the Murayama Trail, across the Lunga. Instead of going all the way back, they established themselves on Upper Lunga River. And there, that hospital, 4th area hospital, they had 3 to 4 of the 75 millimeter guns. They set up what the Japanese called airfield artillery firing platform. So 75 millimeter mountain howitzers was firing on the airfield, in conjunction with the 150 millimeter howitzers firing from way down the west coast at Kukumbana at 10 miles away. So what Hayakataki had planned to do was use the second, once they rallied at Upper Lunga, and they call it the offensive base. And he was going to use them to basically advance again from that direction once they got resupplied. Colonel Oka's group, what I remember we talked about earlier, did the envelopment on the Matanikau. They'd moved up to Mount Austin, and there they formed another offensive base. Remember, the Japanese are not labeling these. If you look at the contemporary records and messages at the time, nothing said defensive in it. It was always offensive, offensive, offensive. So their whole plans was to go back on the offensive once these fresh troops came. So they were up in the Upper Lunga. The right column under Colonel Soji, the 230th, he had 2 battalions of the 230th, and they had one of the battalions of the 124th Regiment on long. So that battalion of the 124th, in conjunction with some of the mortars and machine guns, moved back with Murayama to the left column and moved back. Where Soji continued with 2 battalions to a place called Koli Point, which is 11 miles east of the marine perimeter. And there they were going to meet up with another group coming in by sea. And that was where that column went. You got to remember, there's only one communication line, and that starts at Kukumbana. It goes through the Murayama Road, 15 miles, into the Upper Lunga. And that's, once we said before, that road is not really a road. It's just a jungle track. So that was the only supply line they had. And the trailhead was at Kukumbana on the coast. So that was the most vertical spot the Japanese had. So if you cut that off, you'd cut up basically a whole division off in the jungle, and they'll wither on the vine. So that's where we find ourselves at the end of October.
And that highlights the value of Vandegrift's interior lines of supply as opposed to the way that the Japanese are laid out, because with Shoji moving up to Koli Point, they've got lots of troops spread out effectively all over the AO, and none of them are able to support each other.
No, and they basically don't have any supplies, really. Their supplies consisted of porters, what some guys can throw on their back. And that's it. And once again, just like we used to see in all the military broken forces around the world then and now, once the supplies start moving up, it's going to pass all the rear area troops. They'll go, oh, just give me a little bit of that water. Oh, give me a little bit of that ration. And by the time it gets to the front, there's nothing left.
So do you want to talk us through the supply situation partially for the troops at the front, but also for the Japanese, for the 17th Army in general? How well supplied are they at this point in time?
Well, they're not that well supplied because we discussed in the last episode how the Cactus Air Force ruled the day. So they couldn't bring the Japanese couldn't bring these large transports in to just dump tons and tons of supplies. So the only supplies they were getting in was from these fast destroyers in and out at night. But they're limited at what they could bring in, supply-wise, food, and troop-wise. It was like piecemeal. And to think they could bring in like 2 days, with even of a mass run of destroyers every 2 or 3 days, they'd only bring in enough food for the whole army for 2 days. And that's dumping it off and then trying to get it all the way to the guys in the front line, which is just trickle, just like I said before. You can dump it off, but how are you going to get it to the front line? They did have some trucks. Once again, you got the Cactus Air Force, the road network and infrastructure is not really there. It starts out, you could bring it to a certain point, but then you got to go 5, 6, 7 miles through thick jungle, up and down ravines, carrying it by hand. So you can just imagine what supplies are actually reaching the front, which is next to nothing.
So that's the Japanese scheme of maneuver for the next operation. What's Vandegrift's intent? So
Hayakatake was counting on the Americans. They said, look, the Americans have got hit pretty hard. We don't expect a counteroffensive. They probably don't have it in them. So that's going to give us some breathing room. So that's another thing they're confident was up. But Vandegrift basically said, I've got an exact quote, him and his chief of staff, Thomas, said, we had no intention of letting them just sit there. Vandegrift thought, well, my troops are weak. They're tired. You got to remember, this is 1 November or late October. So they'd been there for 2.5 months and they were worn out. They were sick. The malaria, they didn't get any sleep. Their food was like hardly anything, and what food they got wasn't that great. So they're malnutritioned. They were combat fatigued. They should have been pulled out probably a month earlier. But anyway, they were there. And he says, what forces can I use? Well, I can't not take advantage of this. If we do a drive down the coast, if we hit Cochabamba, we know they got a whole division spread out in the jungle, and we'll cut them off. And we know that we've just defeated the guys at the Matanikau. We smashed their tank attack. We basically destroyed a good part of the regiment. So we think they're weak there. We need to take advantage. It's just a nice, strong punch straight down the coast. So he thought, who do I have to do this? He had the 5th Marines. Now, the 5th Marines were on the western perimeter, and they wasn't really involved in the Battle of Henderson Field. So he was going to use those, and he was going to use probably one of his most aggressive commanders, Colonel Merritt Edson. Once again, he's not the Raider Battalion commander anymore. Remember, he's the 5th Regimental commander. So he's going to use Edson, his entire 5th Marines regiment. He took 3-2, which was 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, and he sent them to Tulagi. And remember, this whole 2nd Marines had been garrisoned Tulagi during this time. So he brought the rest of the 2nd Marines and the guy called Colonel John Arthur regiment and brought them over. And they had included basically a battalion of artillery with them too, 75 millimeters. So he brought 2 fresh battalions and with that artillery. So that would give him, then he had an engineer battalion, then he had some of his special weapons battalion, and then he had at least 4 battalions of artillery. That would give him, and then he had the 3rd Battalion, the 7th Marines, with the Whaling group, with this 100-man scout sniper group under Bill Whaling. So attached themselves to the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. So you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, including engineers, 7, probably roughly about 8 battalions. And then you included the 4 artillery battalions. So you had 12 battalions. This was going to be the largest U.S. Marine land attack in its history to date. So even Vandegrift said once he gathered them all together, he said, I even surprised myself at what we could get scraped together. But he had them. He got them very quickly. And once again, we talk about the benefit interior lines. They could bring that force within 3 days and put them up at the Matanikau. So the plan was, it's after a large bombardment of air and artillery, the 2 battalions of the 5th Marines with the 3rd Battalion, the 7th on the left, so it'd be a 3-battalion assault. They went in and they had footbridges, prefabricated footbridges with engineers. They went in the night before. They crossed the river in boats, rubber boats, because they knew the Japanese wasn't manning the line. Japanese put some false positions there because Japanese knew anyone they put on the Matanikau line would be smashed by artillery. So what the Japanese had done, they'd moved back 2,000 yards, a place called Point Cruz area. They dug in along the ravines there and built them a nice defensive line. So the attack was going to proceed the night before across in boats, like a little riverhead with a couple of companies. They were going to form a riverhead, then the assist engineers putting those 3 footbridges out, and then early in the morning they were going to attack across, which they did. So all 3 battalions attacked across. Everything was going well until the 1st Battalion of the 5th Marines around Point Cruz hit the Japanese line, and they basically ran into a buzzsaw. They got stopped. The 2nd Battalion of 5th Marines held, and then Whalen's group did a flanking attack. So basically over a period of 3 days, the 2nd Marines too had been moving in to move around. So they're going to drive all the Kukumbana. So after a period of 3 days, they trapped the Japanese in a pocket around Point Cruz and destroyed them. They killed like almost 400 Japanese, took a number of anti-tank guns, machine guns, and they had them destroyed. Then the 2nd Marines had leapfrogged past the 5th, and they were pushing their way to a Kukumbana. And that was the 4th Battle Matanikau. So it looked like Kukumbana was in sight. And that brings us to the 3rd of November. But once again, just like everything else in the Guadalcanal campaign, the seesaw battle or seesaw campaign, another action influenced the ongoing action. And it generally occurs from the sea. Sea action or intelligence saying something's about to happen impacts the operations. And it did here on the 3rd. Well, really the 2nd. But yeah, with some intelligence coming in.
That was an ultra decrypt, was it?
Yeah, ultra magic decrypt.
Magic, yep.
Comes from Halsey's South Pacific headquarters. They basically had the Japanese were coming in doing a landing at a place called Koli Point, which I said was 11 miles to the east of the marine perimeter. The Japanese were coming with a major fleet, land at Koli Point. So that made Vandegrift go, okay, we haven't received any information. But then I think on the 1st or the 2nd, some of the information the Marines captured at Point Cruz kind of confirmed that the Japanese intended to land a lot of troops at Koli Point on the night of the 2nd of November. They actually knew which night it was coming down.
That referred to a different plan, which had been the 17th Army thought was logistically unsupportable. So they'd terminated that plan, though, hadn't they?
Yeah, it was the other way around. So the 17th Army said, look, they said, what do you want this 38th Division? And Hayakitaki says, land them at Koli Point. Put a whole division on the other side, and that's going to trap the Americans. But then once that plan got up to the Imperial General Headquarters, due to the logistical situation, they said, well, it's probably not a good idea. What we're going to do is we're going to deviate from that. We're going to land the whole division on the west side, and then with it and the 2nd Division, then it would be a western push. Because once again, the Japanese didn't have enough supplies to supply 2 basically unsupported groups on both sides of the perimeter. And plus they wanted to consolidate the combat power into one hit, because this time they were going to like push straight down the coast with another element coming off the mountains, Matanikau, the upper slopes of the Mount Austin, a 2-pronged assault and coming that way. And that was the plan. So basically, once they diverted it, you still had Soji over to the right-hand side. So Soji initially was going to meet the rest of the division there. That was his division, the rest of the 38th. But what they told Soji was, okay, well, we'll still bring in some troops. There was one company of the 230 from Soji. It didn't participate. So they had that company, and they had supplies for 2,000 men for 10 days. They were going to land. And what they're going to do, they're going to land, give the supplies to Soji's groups. The Soji's group's about 1,500 men. Because remember, it's not a whole regiment because there are only 2 battalions and some engineers. Got to replenish Soji's men. Then Soji was given the marching orders. Then they were going to move up back to the upper Lunga to relieve the 2nd Division there. And the 2nd Division then was going to move back down to Murayama Road and go back to Kukumbana or around that area to do the assault. So that was the plan. But the Marines or the Americans stopped the whole division coming there with intelligence and plus some of the information that come in. So Vandegrift, he didn't want to suspend his operations because he said, we're almost at Kukumbana. But I can't ignore what's happening potentially on my east flank. So that's when he He says, well, I don't have anyone left because I've just seen everyone in the assault. I've only got the 7th Marines and some other guys guarding the perimeter, because he really took a gamble for the integrity of the perimeter. So he says, look, I'll use 2nd Battalion, 7 Marines under H.H. Hanneken. They had a hard battle a battle in Henderson Field. So I'll send them just to Koli Point on a bit of reconnaissance and just sit there and overlook these, quote, beaches that the Japanese are supposed to be landing in on the night of the 2nd, 3rd. So you send on the 4th March, Hanneken's battalion goes out there to set up camp on the night of the 2nd, just to see what's coming in.
The plan for the Japanese has got a lot of marching involved.
Yep.
A lot of marching for troops that have already done a lot of marching. They've already seen a lot of fighting, and they haven't received a lot of logistics. That's probably the plan that they've got that they were trying to execute probably wasn't feasible, was it?
No, once again, they wouldn't really. The planners underestimated terrain. They overestimated the capacity of their forces, and the intelligence wasn't that great. Common factors throughout the campaign you'll see with the Japanese and some extent the Americans, but yeah, Japanese were big foe. They did that.
I kind of get the feeling that they never really thought that they needed the intelligence. They would find the enemy where they found them, and then they would destroy them in place.
Yeah, probably a bit of hubris too, I think, and a bit of overconfidence.
So do you want to talk us through the move? We've got Shoji's moving off to Koli Point to link up. There's some detached troops from previous battles there and the freshly landed troops. How does that move progress?
So Hanneken's guys are waiting, and they did. They'd seen the Japanese land, and then Hanneken waiting for daylight to see what he could do. Communications had went out at night. Then he couldn't communicate back to the division. And he said, I'll just wait till daylight would come. So daylight came. He still could communicate with the division. There was some transports flying in and out, these transport flights. He tried to communicate with them, couldn't do it. So that morning, he engaged the Japanese. And then he thought, well, there's a lot of Japanese here. And potentially, he's seen a cruiser out there. He goes, well, they're going to hit me with the cruiser fire. And plus, he was just receiving reports that Japanese had landed behind him. So he's at Matanikau River. So he thought, well, I need to get out of here. So he starts pulling back. At this stage, division doesn't know any of this is happening. They couldn't even hear the fighting. So it took almost a better part of the day. Then he's moved all the way back. When he's moved back probably a good mile, he reestablished once he dug in along another river, he reestablished communications and told Vandegrift what he had. So at that stage, Vandegrift said whatever he had left. So he had the 164th Regiment, which is guarding the eastern perimeter. He goes, well, we know what's on the eastern side. So he's pulled 2 of the battalions of those guys and just gave them marching orders and said, do a force march straight to Koli. He took the 7th Marines, 1-7 under Chesty Puller, and the rest of the 7th Marines, the 1-3-7 was up on the Matanikau. But he took the regimental headquarters under Colonel Sims, 1-7, and they put them by boat, and they hooked up a landing craft and landed and joined Hanneken. So he basically had almost 2 regiments there. So he didn't have hardly anyone at the perimeter right now, guarding the perimeter. He has a major force at the Matanikau to the west and a major force going to the east. But what he did, Vandegrift said, well, I'll suspend my operations to the west because, once again, I have to protect the airfield. So he's pulled Edson's 5th Marines back on the 3rd. So they've made it back, and then they are in the perimeter. So he's left the 2nd Marines, 1 battalion of the 164th Army up around Point Cruz just to hold that area that already seized, and they had an all-around perimeter. And they were going to suspend the operations. Once they dealt with the east, then they were going to recommence the operations to the west because they didn't want to give that up. He basically had 2 ongoing fights. Now, this brings up a command and control situation for him because at this stage, he's got the equivalent of almost 2 divisions, at least a division and a half, and plus his air. So you're almost getting a corps-size unit. So it's getting a bit unwieldy for him. So what he did was he had 2 brigadier generals. And then General Edmund Seabury was the U.S. Army. He was part of the Matanikau division. So he's landed in advance of the division because you already had 1 regiment there in 164. So Seabury's landed, and then you had William Rupertus on Tulagi. So he's brought both those brigadier generals down, and Rupertus was going to run the eastern show. And then later, he was going to send Seabury to run the western once they recommenced the attack. But Seabury was quote, an observer right now around Koli Point. There's 2 brigadier generals at Koli Point, but Rupertus is running it, while Vandegrift is back at command overall with the whole operation. And Colonel Arthur is off to the west holding. So, yeah. So you got all those forces, and Rupertus's job, once he gathered all his Army and Marines, was to first locate these Japanese, try to box them in and destroy them. So that was the goal, the Koli Point.
The action at Koli Point highlights an interesting or a significant problem that occurs in jungle combat, in particular, friendly fire. So Hannikin's unit had a friendly fire incident over one of the nights where a firefight broke out between two units. And Shoji almost had a friendly fire incident as he was trying to marry up with the troops at Koli Point, didn't he?
And I don't think it was Hannikin's guys. I know the 2nd Battalion and the 164th had a major friendly fire incident on the night of the 6th.
Oh, might have been the 164th. Yep.
Yeah, they did. Because once again, the 164th performed very well at Coffin Corner and Battle of Henderson Field, especially from defensive positions. But they had to shift to an offensive posture, offensive operations, which is another kettle of fish. As you know, it's a lot harder. And this is the first time in them basically doing field maneuvers and offensive combat maneuvers. So they were a bit slow, and the Marines were getting frustrated. Like Rupertus and the Marine High Command was getting frustrated, not thinking back until August and September how their guys, first time in offensive combat, doing the same thing. There's Army moving too slow, not aggressive enough. That area, when Army didn't have maps, they basically given them like compass readings and say, here's your compass reading, go and, they in the thick jungle, mango swamps, kunai grass. And the first time in really maneuver and warfare and combat against an enemy. So they got to try to move through because it was so delayed. Their Colonel Moore had them moving at night, which is Americans hadn't trained at night. And hence he had a major blue on blue or friendly fire incident. I was reading the account of one of the platoon commanders. He sees moving through there, and he's a machine gun platoon commander, and they're moving. And he heard some shooting off to the left. And he said, "Oh, Japanese." And one of his sergeants says, "Hold on a minute, those are Brownings." And they said he had the sick feeling then that they knew they were getting shot at with their own men. So yeah, a lot of these National Guard guys blame Moore for that. He was a West Point regular officer. It was thrown in and to replace their National Guard officer before they left for Guadalcanal. So there's a bit of finger pointing. But they were probably experiencing what you see a green unit for the first time doing offensive maneuvers experience. So they were having a hard time trying to find these Japanese. What the Japanese were doing, they were using delaying tactics. They'd leave small machine gun teams or rifle teams. It's basically delaying. The Japanese were moving back to form at a place called Gavalva Creek. And Gavalva Creek was where they had their supplies were dropped off. So they were going back there. And remember Soji, his unit was replenishing there. But Soji on the 7th of November received orders from Haikitaki to start moving. So him and the bulk of his units on the 7th started moving out. But they've left behind a rear guard and obviously some sick and wounded that couldn't move. So they're all at Gavalva Creek. But they're fighting a good, masterfully delaying tactics, holding back the Americans.
We'll leave the story there and we'll come back next week to continue the story of the pursuit of this Japanese force. However, before we go, there's a couple of points that I've reflected on. Firstly, with American troops just 1,000 yards from Cochabonum, the 17th Army's headquarters and the logistics base for the Japanese on Guadalcanal, he decides to pull back. And as Dave said, he came to regret that decision. However, hindsight is always 20/20, and it's important to think about what he was trying to achieve with that advance. His decision to exploit the victory at Henderson Field was partially brought about by improving logistics. Remember, on the 23rd of October, he had flown to Noumea for a meeting with Halsey, and Halsey had promised him all of the support that he could give. The improving logistics gave Vandegrift riches beyond the dreams of avarice, and this was part of his calculations in taking the offensive. However, flexibility comes often from the ability to employ a reserve to meet changing circumstances. He was conducting operations to the east and the west of Henderson Field. Had he been met with an unexpected Japanese offensive, he would have struggled to deal with it appropriately, and hence his decision to withdraw the forces as they neared Cochabona. The other point is the long shadow that is cast by the poor logistics planning of the 17th Army and indeed Imperial Japanese headquarters, and indeed poor logistics planning at the grand strategic level for the Japanese. The cancellation of the original Koli operation for the Japanese was brought about because it was logistically unsustainable. However, the situation for the Japanese from a sustainment point of view was already dire. The figures that have been calculated by the 17th Army were that to support the 30,000 troops that they had on Guadalcanal, they needed 200 tons of provisions per day. That works out to be 5 destroyer loads per night, or 150 per month. The Tokyo Express was only running every third night on average. So rather than 200 destroyer loads, they were only getting 60 per month, around 1/3 of what they needed. Imperial Headquarters in Tokyo was struggling to understand the lack of progress being made on Guadalcanal. However, 17th Army replied that terrain and especially logistics circumscribed their firepower, and they needed to look for other solutions. They sent back to their higher headquarters the following observation. For every 10 units of resupply planned, only 6 were sent, only 3 were landed, and only 2 survived for consumption. This highlights the dire logistics situation that the 17th Army is labouring under. If you think that logistics sets the left and right of arc of what is physically possible and can be done in a campaign, we start to see some of the problems of the planned offensive that the Japanese are looking to undertake. The 8th Fleet staff work indicated that to move the 38th Division, the 51st Division, and the 21st Independent Mixed Brigade, that would require sea lift for 30,000 troops, 300 guns, and 3,000 tons of supplies. So this amount of men and material would require 50 transports or 800 destroyers and 20 seaplane carrier runs. Another little interesting fact comes out of this. So they're using destroyers because they've got the ability to get into Guadalcanal, unload, and get back out again before daylight and before they're under risk of attack from the Cactus Air Force. But a destroyer can only carry 1/16 of the cargo that a transport would have been able to carry. However, transports move too slowly and they take too long to unload, particularly because both the Japanese and the Americans are still doing over-the-shore logistics. For the Americans, ships would anchor up in the Lunga anchorage and then they would be unloaded using the booms on the ship into LCVPs, or Landing Craft Vehicle and Personnel. There were also a number of lighters and barges that were being used. For the Japanese, the situation was a lot worse. The Tokyo Express, or as the Japanese referred to it, rat transportation, because of the nature that they were sneaking in. Destroyers would bring troops in and they would be offloaded down scramble nets or into small boats. Equipment would be put in 55-gallon drums and pushed overboard. It was extremely difficult to get any heavy equipment in, and this meant that large caliber guns couldn't be brought in, nor could the ammunition for those guns. So despite the ability of the Japanese artillery to range Henderson Field, they weren't able to put the airfield out of action for long enough to permit decent convoys to come in and reinforce the Japanese. So because there wasn't enough artillery ammunition, they weren't able to neutralize the airfield, and because they couldn't neutralize the airfield, they weren't able to bring in enough artillery ammunition. They find themselves in an insidious catch-22. For the Marine and Army units on Guadalcanal, they benefit from their interior lines of communication. The logistics doesn't need to go that far to be transported to the front lines. This is why we see the average Japanese soldier in such a parlous state at this point of the campaign. We'll leave the campaign here and we will return next week to pick up with the pursuit of the Japanese forces from Koli Point.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.